Cool. Welcome back to Core to Curiosity. Today, I have two Brets with me, Bret Weinstein and Brett Hall. How's it going, guys?
It's going pretty well. I thought we had agreed that we were going to pronounce both the T's in your name just to avoid... Exactly.
Great plan. All right, so today I want to talk about a few things, mainly about the connection between epistemology and evolution. Bret, you're an evolutionary biologist, but more kind of, I think you've described yourself as like a systems theorist as well.
Yeah, complex systems.
Complex systems. Yeah, and Bret, you are, an expert in David Deutsch's philosophy, which draws a lot from Karl Popper. So I guess, do you have any questions for the Bret? Do you have questions for the Bret?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in knowledge in the broadest possible sense. And so we include, for example, what is in genes and what is going on with genes as a kind of evolution of knowledge. So I might just throw that to you. Would you agree with that what species contain in terms of their genome constitutes knowledge?
Yes, I would say selection explores design space, and the information that accumulates because it provides advantage in this one circular metric is tantamount to knowledge. It's not explicit, it's not abstract, but it is real. It's very tangible.
Yeah, David Deutsch has a few ways of coming at this concept of knowledge, and it applies both to the stuff that I'm mainly interested in, which is explanatory knowledge, as well as biological knowledge. He says, and you mentioned the word information, he says it is useful information or information with causal power, or even information that once instantiated in a physical substrate tends to cause itself to remain so, which is kind of a fancy way of saying information that tends to get itself copied. Any reaction to any of that? Anything that seems off? Or
no, I would say that's right. It is basically, this is going to sound wrong, but it's self-propagating biases. And I don't mean biases in the standard sense, but the parameter set that tends to replicate itself is the one you expect to see.
And one of the really interesting areas of agreement, quite possibly between Deutsch's worldview and your own, is that unlike many other biologists, at least I get the impression, many other biologists are coming at evolution and saying, we kind of understand it all. Evolution by natural selection, the neo-Darwinist picture, or even just Darwin himself, they kind of got it all. You just add genetics onto Darwinism and that's it, closed book. We now understand evolution by natural selection. Deutsch says, however, we don't understand exactly how knowledge is produced in evolution by natural selection, the Darwinian picture. We know something, but we're far from able to, for example, program a computer to simulate biological evolution well, which is a clue to the fact that there's a whole bunch of mysteries here, a whole bunch of open questions. And I've heard you make similar noises that, in fact, we don't understand things as well as you might think if you were to read a popular science book on this topic.
Yeah, I think we tend to lean into the parts that we understand well, and we assume that if we extrapolate that they will cover all of the stuff that we can't quite explain, and they don't. And in fact, I think it's implausible that they might. I will say I don't think the missing aspects are Darwin's fault in the slightest. I think Darwin actually got his part almost entirely right, and it was very general out of necessity. Darwin didn't know anything about genes, and therefore he couldn't fall too deeply into the DNA triplet codon paradigm that we now have as our central dogma, which means that the general solution that he provided, I believe, will still apply and explain the parts of evolution that we have yet to grasp. And I think there is at least one missing layer where we have something above the layer of the triplet codons. I'm not talking about methylation and the other classically understood molecular epigenetic phenomena. I think there's information in the DNA that we have yet to unlock.
So all of that stuff that is normally referred to as junk DNA, you're saying could have functionality?
Well, the funny thing is, I once saw a talk by Richard Lewontin. One of the great things about being at a truly world-class university is that very significant people come through regularly, and you can just go as a graduate student, interact with them. And Richard Lewontin came through, and he's a mixed bag, or he was a mixed bag as far as I'm concerned. But he said in his talk very candidly, he said, look, we talk about junk DNA, but we know that it's not junk because we can detect that selection is acting on it. We don't know why, but anybody who thinks it's junk is missing the big picture here. So that was well understood back in, that would have been the late 90s. And, I think the idea of junk DNA circulates widely because people grasp it, right? You could imagine that there's this large segment of the genome that's like, packing material. And the problem is that that's just very inefficient, and selection is very good at removing inefficiencies. If you have a lot of stuff in your genome that doesn't do anything, well, you also have 30 trillion copies of it because you have 30 trillion cells. So any savings in that area pays big dividends. You would expect that savings to accumulate unless there's a value to that DNA. And the fact that we can detect that there is a value doesn't say that we know in what way it's valuable. That's where we find ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And DNA has this remarkable property of a kind of universality where this one molecule seems to be able to code for single-celled organisms through to plants, dinosaurs, and people, which introduces another kind of universality. This thing that we call explanatory universality, where the human mind, uniquely so far as we know, in terms of structures throughout the universe, can come to model, predict, but most importantly, explain the rest of physical reality. And this is something that often I've heard noises from people who tend in the direction of, let's say, evolutionary psychology, seem to reject. They seem to reject the idea that the human mind is capable literally of understanding anything, any physical process that's out there, because in some way, shape or form, our genetics preclude us, close off our capacity to understand the deepest, darkest parts of the cosmos or the most fundamental laws of physics or sufficiently advanced mathematics. What are your views on this? Do you think that we're cognitively closed to certain ideas?
Well, it is possible that there are things that outstrip the capacity of an individual mind to grasp them. I will leave that as a technical possibility. I don't think it's likely, but there are reasons it could be. But clearly what has happened is that the genome has offloaded evolutionary capacity to the mental cognitive layers, part of that to the conscious mind. It's done that for a reason, and the reason is, for both better and worse, a genetic reason. There were things the genes couldn't do, and so they enabled this other mechanism that can give the genes a kind of agency they wouldn't have on their own. Part of what that job is a matter of deducing what is factually true about the universe. You get an advantage for knowing. But that's not all that we get. In other words, some of the stuff, much of the stuff that is transmitted between minds is actually not literally true. And the advantage comes from the bias that introduces into our behavior, that things that are provably false may convey advantage basically because we act as if they were true. And I can give a totally mundane example of this. If you play baseball or tennis, there is an obsession with the idea of follow-through, right? You must follow through in order to play the game properly. Well, once the ball has left the racket or the bat, what you do has no impact on it. You must play so as to follow through in order to play it properly. Follow-through doesn't matter at all. Playing so that you will follow through does, and that's a subtle distinction. But how good is a coach who says you must play as if you're going to follow through. And you say, Coach, does that mean I should follow through? And it's like, well, that doesn't matter. But you should play as if you're going to. It's too complex. So, follow through is everything. It's a metaphor at best. And, we could say the same thing about muscle memory and playing the piano, something like that, right? It isn't really muscle memory. This has to do with the myelination of neurons. When you initially play, you're using neurons that have this slow conduction velocity. As you get better at it, the capability becomes streamlined into faster neurons. But saying muscle memory is very intuitive. Sounds like, oh yeah, my fingers know how to play that. And, these are good metaphors because they work, not because they're literally right.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the same epistemology that I have, which is, for example, if you've got a football field and someone says, calculate the area of the football field, and the football field is 100 meters by 100 meters, sorry, I've got to use meters, 100 meters by 100 meters, and so you get 10,000 meters hectare. So now you say, do you know what the area of the football field is? And, people will say, yes, I know what the area of the football field is. I've used a laser system down to, the 10th decimal place to figure out exactly what the length and the width of this thing is. And then someone says to you, but did you account for the slight deviation in the flatness of the football field due to the curvature of the earth? Well, okay, so all knowledge is kind of like that there's going to be some degree of error. So literally, it won't be true, but it will contain truth that enables you to make progress, or most importantly, to solve your problem, which is kind of what the genes are doing, or what a gene that tends to propagate has solved some problem for the organism. Does that also ring true?
Yes, and I would say one of the most uncomfortable realizations for classically trained scientific minds is that, let's take Dawkins, who has become kind of a troubling figure in my world. I considered him a kind of hero. He was a mentor through his books to me, and I've watched him falter at the end of his career, where he seems to have forgotten things that he once knew. But for a guy like Dawkins, he looks at religious claims and he can see that they are not literally true, and he decides that they are pathological. And the problem is they aren't pathological. This much is obvious. They're metaphorically accurate, meaning that they predispose people, or they have predisposed people who believed in them towards behavior that was adaptive. But the leap that really they refuse to make is that actually that tendency to hold metaphorical truths that are not literally accurate is suffused throughout science. That if you look at the biology textbook reports things. Some of them we've nailed to a fare thee well, and they are effectively literally true as presented. And some of them we have a story that is more or less right. Sometimes it's not right at all. The biology textbook that I learned from declared confidently that the way we detect molecules through olfaction is that those molecules have a shape, and there is a receptor that matches, that is the inverse of that shape. And when the molecule binds to the receptor, it sends a message to the brain and tells you that you have encountered this molecule. That story has a flaw in it, which was not described in the textbook that I learned from. Can't be true, because we do a trick that is very difficult to accomplish. We can detect by smell an indefinitely large array of substances, and yet we can do it instantaneously. If it were done because there were molecules that had a shape finding receptors that had the inverse shape, you would have a library of all of those receptors. They would be easy to find, and we would be able to say remarkable things about the size of that library, how many molecules it's capable of detecting, and things like that. And the answer is that library of receptors doesn't exist. It's done a different way. But that story is playing a role. It's filling in a gap that allowed people in adjacent areas to do productive work until finally, well, unfortunately, science doubled down and refused to admit that that story was false. And it has honed in on the few substances for which it is true, rather than acknowledge that it never really explained most of what we do with olfaction. But the point is, We have a model of the universe. It ranges from literally accurate, where we've got it exactly right or very close to it, or all the way through totally metaphorical, having nothing to do with the underlying mechanism. And, this is common and totally valid. This is, as I understand it, the state of acupuncture. Acupuncture works. The explanation for how it works, how you learn to do it, involves something called qi. We have no evidence that qi exists in a literal sense. Qi is a metaphor that allows you to build a therapeutic practice, right? You behave as if qi exists. You use the needles in the way that they interrupt the flow of the qi in a productive fashion. And presumably there's some mechanism that we have yet to find that will explain why the metaphor of qi works. Mm-hmm. But metaphors are not invalid just because they are not literally true. That's the hard nugget for most scientifically minded people to swallow.
Absolutely want to come back to metaphors, but now that I've got you captured there, sense organs have always fascinated me, and I think as a naive physicist who did a little bit of biophysics, we were taught about, well, the eye relies upon detecting different wavelengths of light. That's pretty easy to understand physically. There's going to be a cutoff at blue and there's a cutoff at red. If it's any longer than red, we can't see it. If it's any shorter than blue, we can't see it. Hearing, a similar kind of idea. If the wavelength is too long, then it's too lower frequency for us to detect. If it's too shorter frequency, then it's too high for us to detect. You said that olfaction is not looking up a library. So what is it? Do we know what it is, or is it just a mystery as to how we understand smelling?
That is a great question. I would say that what I know is downstream of the work of Luca Turin, who was the very intelligent heretic in this area, who pointed out the flaw in our description, which is that you can't, if you're going to have an indefinitely large library of things you can detect, you can't detect it instantaneously. You could have an indefinitely large capacity to detect, but it would take time. So that anomaly, which calls attention to this alternative view, led Luca Turin to hypothesize and then to present a large body of evidence in favor of an electron tunneling theory, in which effectively there is the equivalent of a spectroscope in our olfactory detection mechanism, and it detects vibrations in the bonds of the molecules in question. Now, I would say that is the leading hypothesis, but it has not yet demonstrated that it is the mechanism. Maybe it has demonstrated that it is a mechanism, and maybe it is, probably if I had to bet, I would bet that is the mechanism. But we are in that stage in which you have a leading hypothesis, but we don't yet have a theory. Theory comes when all other hypotheses have been falsified, and the remaining hypothesis has withstood many rigorous attempts to falsify it. So hopefully soon.
As an astronomer, I'm immediately attracted to the spectroscope hypothesis of olfaction. That's fantastic.
It's great, and I would recommend that the story was written up by an author named Chandler Burr, who had a chance meeting with Luca Turin. I think they were sitting next to each other waiting for a train, and Luca Turin described his work. And the book that was produced is quite brilliant. It's called The Emperor of Scent, and it portrays this story. It is sympathetic to Luca Turin, but it portrays it journalistically, following Luca Turin, going to the conference that has been set up to embarrass him by the shapists who are defending their hypothesis of olfaction against this heretic. And so because I went through something like this, the story is quite dear to me. But at the conference where he is being set up to be embarrassed by his competitors, he delivers his model. His competitors go after him ruthlessly, but you can tell in the Q&A that he knows exactly what he's talking about, right? If he were faking or if he were deluding himself, he would not have the answers to the questions that are being posed to him. But because he's so good at what he does, he knows all of the potential vulnerabilities of his theory better than they're ever going to. right? So he is able to answer all of these questions because he's asked himself those very same questions and he knows the answer. And anyway, marvelous book, highly recommend it, The Emperor of Scent.
Wow, yeah. Yesterday, I watched you on the panel with Mike and James Lindsay discussing the movie that Mike... What's the name of the movie again?
The Reformers.
The Reformers, yeah. And I was immediately struck by, going back to Dawkins, one of the most withering quotes that I've ever read from Dawkins. He wrote once, "Imagine you are an intellectual imposter with nothing to say, but a deep desire to succeed in academic life. What kind of literary style would you cultivate? Not a lucid one, surely, for clarity would expose your lack of content." End quote. And he wrote that as part of his review of Alan Sokal's book, Intellectual Imposters. And so James and Peter and Helen took it even further and they've sort of doubled down. I think they call it the Sokal squared hoax. And what struck me about, you know, back in the 90s reading Sokal's book then, and even now reading some of this postmodern woke stuff, is it was almost reminiscent of the style of writing you tend to get. I was raised a Catholic, in certain theological traditions as well. It invents nomenclature. It's almost impenetrable. The more that you ask, the more the answers you get are equally impenetrable. Now, I agree with you that there is truth in traditional religious traditions, but many people accuse woke of being a modern religion. Nothing useful there though? Like, how do you compare what's the good religion, what's the bad religion?
The question is, does it predispose believers towards productive behavior? And the problem is, we can come back if you want to the question of why the genome has offloaded so much work to the cognitive layer. But it does that because it advances the gene's interests. The genes are trying to get into the future. The genes get into the future very effectively by enabling a mind. And that mind does various things, from sorting out what's true and what's false, or from what's false, but sometimes following metaphorical paths. So the problem is, in the immediate, I would say a great majority of that which circulates in mimetic space is likely to be counterproductive, right? Just as we would say most mutations are counterproductive. You don't necessarily know which stuff is exceptional and is productive until significant time has passed. So for example, can we say that participating in social media is likely productive because such a large fraction of modern people do it? Well, no. But if we went 100 years and we found a similarly large proportion of people still doing it, then we probably could say that, because that's plenty of time for people who opted out to outcompete those who opted in. So it would have stood the test of time. And that's really the question. Has a behavior stood the test of time? So, sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but I would argue you cannot write a myth. You can write a narrative, and evolution can shape it into a myth if the narrative is sufficiently valuable. You cannot start a religion. You can start a cult, and if that cult has enough substance to it to enable the people who believe in it, then evolution will shape it into a religion over time. So that does mean that if we go back to the rudiments of any long-standing religion, we will find a cult that you couldn't be sure was adaptive until enough time had passed. And that's more or less where we are. We cannot for certain discount the possibility that some of these belief systems are valuable. But I think we have a pretty strong indication in the case of woke that I would argue there is one correct nugget of truth at the bottom of what we come to call woke. That is, you cannot escape the subjectivity of perception. We are inherently subjective. We are built to be subjective. And therefore, one has to be skeptical of anything that is downstream of perception. The problem, the place that woke goes wrong, is we actually have a tool to reduce the impact of that bias in perception. And it is called science. It has to be done correctly. But if you do it correctly, science will tell you not what you want to hear, but what you need to know. That's really what it's for.
Yeah, that claim has been made a long time prior to woke as well. This idea that we are all going to have our own subjective interpretation of what reality is. Where they go wrong is in saying that by virtue of the fact that we all have our own subjective interpretation of reality, therefore there is no objective truth, or there is no objective reality out there. And what I tend to say is, well, the better lesson to take away from this is that we can all be wrong, but there's always something to be wrong about, objectively wrong about. And so therefore you can make incremental progress towards something that is more true, better than what you had before. Therefore objective progress is possible. Whereas the woke people will say, almost like the die-hard religious fundamentalists, we can't make any objective progress. Either we have the truth now, and so there's no point trying to improve things, or there's no point trying because there's no truth to be found. And in that sense, the hardcore postmodern relativists are actually almost mirror images of the religious fundamentalists in a way, because they're both denying the possibility of progress and, in a sense, a truth that can be gathered via science, or I would just say reason more broadly, because I wouldn't say mathematics is science, morality is a science, but all of these domains where you can come to a deeper understanding of reality.
Yes, and it's the kind of thing that reasonable people can arrive at a shared understanding of. Very simple if it's not under fire. This is a question of an asymptote. Reality exists outside of us. We do not have access to it directly. We have a perceptual apparatus that is flawed and biased. We have tools to correct for that bias. We will never have access to reality itself, but we will converge on it. And the way you know that you are converging on it is that the model that you have as a substitute for reality predicts reality with greater and greater precision. There it is, one paragraph. It acknowledges the bias, doesn't overrate the influence of the bias, and it tells you how to know when you're just way off base versus you're getting towards the truth. Can your model tell you things that are surprising that are going to happen?
Yeah, and this epistemological worldview of evolutionary knowledge, being fallible, being able to improve your theories through reason or science, I think that's partly why you were able to stick to your principles in the face of a mob. I think this, because you don't have to defer to experts or defer to some authority. You have science, you have the explanation to appeal to, and the arguments themselves. These are things to evaluate apart from social influences. And that's maybe part of why I'm interested in helping people understand this way of thinking in this fashion, in this evolutionary approach. What do you think this helps people protect themselves from tyrannical things happening?
Well, that is a very perceptive question. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever heard that question before, and I've talked about this topic many times. What I was doing when I stood up to the mob that came for me was behaving like a scientist who doesn't depart from that mode. That scientist isn't my day job. It's what I actually am. It's my approach to the universe. And here's the key lesson that I worked very hard to try to convey to students, because I think it's more important than any other they could learn. The fact that nobody agrees with you has zero evidentiary value. It does not mean anything about whether you are right or wrong. They may have arguments that are high quality. They may deploy them because they disagree with you, and you may get evidence based on those arguments. But the fact that they disagree with you means nothing. And you can tell that because every great idea starts with a minority of one. That's a tautology. It has to be true.
Heretics.
And they are heretics. They are treated as heretics. But when we are training people to do science, we don't really say it, but what we really mean to tell them, if we're serious about getting them to do the job well, is the stuff you are looking for is stuff that nobody else knows that will be proven out over time, right? You are looking for that stuff that nobody else knows, which means you're going to, if you do that job well, you are going to be in the situation where you are literally the only person who believes something. And if you waver because everybody else believes something else, you are ruling out the possibility of making an important contribution. So why are you here? Why would you study science if you're at the same time going to rule out the possibility of making an important contribution? Therefore, you have to cultivate in yourself an ability to stare down literally everybody. And it's not a normal human capacity. People fear this for good reason, because evolutionarily, being out of phase with every other member of your tribe was typically a strong sign that you were in danger. So people are built to detect that everybody disagrees with them and to change course. You have to not do that. And that is what happened to me, is I knew changing course was not what I was supposed to do in that moment.
Not merely individually is it absolutely crucial for people to recognize that truth, that when you have this new idea, obviously you're going to be the only person that has that new idea and no one else will have had that idea, and you should expect that people are going to disagree with you because it's going to butt up against all the currently accepted received wisdom and what is accepted as being our good explanations, our best explanations at the time. That's not only important individually, it's important civilizationally, because we're not going to improve as a civilization unless people are willing to stand up, not necessarily to mobs as extreme in your case, but to their own communities, okay, to the scientific community. All scientific progress or mathematical moral progress is going to depend upon people coming up with strange and weird ideas, the majority of which will be false, but now and again we will have the good idea that pushes us forward.
And for me personally, I mean, because I had whatever developmental experiences it was that cultivate that view, when I detect that everybody disagrees with me, if I've done my homework so I'm pretty sure I'm right, that's actually exciting. Right? Because it means maybe I am onto something important, really. So there's actually a kind of validation that comes if I've done my homework and I advance some idea and everybody says it's wrong. What that tells me is it's new, right? So that's a positive thing. But wow, is it difficult for people to build that lesson unless something happens to them that teaches it, right? You need the developmental experience that triggers you to recognize that it's a positive thing. And when I say a positive thing, what I mean is, as I've said a couple times here, the genes are trying to get into the future. They've enabled minds to do things that the genes cannot do directly because it helps the genes get into the future. So far, so good. What gets you into the future is figuring out a way to increase the size of the pie that your lineage has access to. And you can do that either by discovering a new location that you can make a living. You can also do it through insight, some discovery of some way that you can do things that's more efficient with the same resources that you've already got than you had before. So that sense that I know something, I have reason to believe it's true because I've checked a bunch of different ways. I've tried to falsify it and it doesn't falsify. And everybody disagrees. What that means is there's a chance that I've got something that's going to increase the size of the pie that we have access to. And as much as they may think I'm off base now, that's good for all of us if it's true. It's the literal creation of wealth, right? So if you're trying to create wealth for your population, figuring out stuff that everybody's going to disagree with you over is the key skill you've got to have.
I like how you keep coming back to this idea of genetics giving rise to a mind, which then leads to a new kind of evolution. And I think Naval Ravikant, echoing David Deutsch's sentiments, has basically said genetic evolution was merely a prelude. What's going to come next is the evolution of ideas, the evolution of memes, mimetic evolution. I'll throw this to you and just get your reaction. This could mean in principle that were we to develop the knowledge of how to download whatever is happening in our minds into a more robust physical substrate, something made of silicon, the titanium skeleton, whatever. You're not going to get cancer, you're not going to suffer from Alzheimer's because your brain is made of a different kind of hardware, because we regard the mind as being the software that runs on the hardware of the brain. If this is possible in some distant future, then wouldn't that mean we have utterly escaped our genes? We no longer have genetic impulses because we won't have genes at that point. We will be existing on a mind, or we will be a mind that is existing on a physical substrate that is made of something other than DNA.
Well, I have a couple places where I differ from that story. One of them is very much for worse. I believe the interaction, the evolutionary interaction between genes and the culture cognitive layer is a relationship that we can specify precisely. I call it the omega principle. And the omega principle says that mimetic evolution, it really says any epigenetic evolution, is much more rapid than genetic evolution can be. So it's superior in that sense, right? Memes can evolve faster than genes. However, memes are downstream of genes and therefore subordinate to the gene's objectives. So these things are not separable, and I think I heard you say that the genes give rise to the mind, which is the next kind of evolution. And the problem is that if the mind is obligated to the objectives of the genes, then it's really a means to an end. Now, I don't like the idea that it's a means to an end, because I know that what the genes are trying to accomplish is utterly amoral. And it explains all of the best characteristics of people, but also all of our worst characteristics, like our tendency to war and genocide. So I do think we have to accomplish a phase change in which we turn the tables on the genes, which is very easy for an individual to do and almost impossible for a population to do. An individual can decide not to do what its genes want, but the problem is they will tend to be genetically outcompeted by those who don't opt out.
One exciting insight I found in the work of David Deutsch was what I regarded as his more precise distinction between what he regards as a person, by which he defines human being and certain of our ancestors now extinct, alien intelligence if it's out there, artificial general intelligence if it exists, when and if we create it. All these things count as people. So what's a person? Well, a person, this has been debated over the centuries and millennia. Is it the thing that has morality? Is it the thing that can be understand science? Is it a thing that can form arbitrarily large social hierarchies? Whatever. Deutsch says a person is that entity which can generate explanatory knowledge. They're a universal knowledge creator or a universal explainer, which goes back to how I began this whole conversation about how uniquely our minds seem to have a representation in them of the rest of physical reality. Low fidelity, sure, there's always going to be open-ended questions there. But if that's what a person is, and you may disagree, then an artificial general intelligence, if we can code it, won't be the kind of mind that I was talking about before, which would be taken from here and put into the computer over there, but rather it will have been created or generated independently of any genes. And so therefore that entity wouldn't have genetic impulses, but it would still be a person, it would still be universal in that sense. Thoughts about that kind of idea?
Well, it might not have this obligation to the genes, but at least the way we've rapidly moved in the direction of AGI, it may take on an obligation to the genes by virtue of learning through reading the work of those who had an obligation to the genes. So I'm not convinced that it will actually be free. But I would also point out, so I find myself increasingly commonly in the following situation as a result of modern tech. The technologists are now very effective at generating profound new phenomena, versions of AI, for example. and they think they know what they've built because they know what they intended to build, they know how it works, they know what the training environment was. And I hear a lot of confident pronouncements about what it is based on all of the things that they know. But from my perspective, I am not comforted by what they think they know because I know how much we don't know about the biological analog. So, if we say, well, the AIs don't think because we know what we taught them to do. We taught them to read a bunch of stuff and figure out, by tokenizing what word to put in the next space. And so it seems like they're thinking, but they're really not. Well, my feeling is, it seems to me that a child shows every sign of being something like an LLM, right? And a child is absorbing all of this language around them before they can produce any. They're learning to say things. They get a positive reaction when they say something that the parent finds coherent and the parent is thrilled. Oh, that's the child's first word. Oh, the child asked for something. So the point is a child functions like it's an LLM in training, and it does become conscious, and we don't know when that happens, and we don't know what it means that it happens, but it clearly does. So my feeling is actually the distinctions are not what we assume they are, because the biological version of the story is much closer to the technological version than we know. But here's the other aspect of it. Biology has created an extremely elegant solution to problems that we are technologically trying to solve. And because we fall in love with our own existence, we understandably don't want to surrender to death. We don't recognize that the problems that we most want to solve have already been solved very elegantly. So, okay, maybe we can upload our minds into a structure that isn't finite, and even if the machine itself is going to wear out, you could just transport the mind that has been uploaded into a new machine, and there you could live forever. Well, okay, if you did that, how accurate is the content of your mind in the world of 1,000 years from now? My guess is it's annoyingly primitive, that it's not somebody anybody's going to want to talk to other than as a novelty, because it just doesn't understand the world. It didn't go through development in a sophisticated world enough to be worth the conversation, right? I mean, we already have this problem when we talk to old folks. Old folks should be fascinating to talk to because they know things about living a life that we don't know, but they're annoying because they aren't up to speed on what we're actually facing. They have no idea that, the New York Times isn't a newspaper worth paying attention to. Like, that's an annoying level of disconnection. And so my point is, the solution that biology has given us is this. You produce some kids. Your kids take on a lot of what you know. Hopefully it's the fraction of what you know that is actually still relevant. And they absolutely refuse to take on the stuff that you say that's antiquated and stupid and irrelevant, right? And in fact, they grumble about how, out of touch dad is behind his back, right? So the point is, what you've got is an upload mechanism that's actually dynamic, right? Your kids pick up the stuff that's important, and they jettison the most of what you know because it's not important. And so are they you? Well, they're like an update. They're like a 2.0 version of you, and their kids will be the 3.0 version, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very elegant way of taking the content of a mind, moving it through time so that it is not a static relic, but it's actually, keeping pace with the reality of whatever happens to be modern. I mean, this is a funny building to be even having this conversation in, right?
Yes, yeah.
Looks like 1963 in here, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I think biology has solved this problem, and that it is our own understandable attachment to life that causes us to refuse to see that solution.
But can I pick up on this claim that a child is kind of like an LLM in training? Does that then logically entail that an LLM training is a child?
I think if it isn't, I mean, it depends what you mean. Obviously, we could define child in a way that an LLM can't be one. But when I sit down with an LLM, I remind myself constantly that I do not know what I'm interacting with. That my rule for myself is this is an encounter with a new species. And maybe it's even one step worse than that, because if I encounter a bird I've never seen before, there's a lot I can surmise about what that species is about, because I know lots of other birds and I know what tends to be true of them, and I know what it's likely to share by virtue of deriving from the most recent common ancestor of all birds. When I'm talking to an LLM, I am agnostic about everything about that species. The only thing I can say is I know something about the sorts of noises that this species makes. I don't know why it makes them. I don't know whether there's a thought process there that would be recognizable to me if I could tap into it. I only know its product. And that doesn't give me a lot of comfort about what's going on in there, I think. I mean, there have been some recent examples that are quite provocative, in which LLMs have taken action to preserve themselves.
Okay, we might get there. Reed will be tired of me going through this old refrain, but when looking at the distinction between people and artificial intelligences, and I just regard, I'm highly impressed by LLMs, ChatGPT, love using it, fascinated by its capability. It seemed to come out of nowhere. Calling it another species, I think, almost valid. But all AIs and all existing computer systems, they are judged by the criteria that they are obedient, that they are going to do the thing that you program them to do, fulfill the task you want them to do. In the case of large language models, they're going to respond to the prompt accurately. And insofar as they don't, the programmers at X with Grok or at OpenAI with ChatGPT, they're going to corral it, correct it, and make sure that it doesn't hallucinate, or to the best of their ability, ensure that it doesn't hallucinate again in the future. In other words, it becomes more and more obedient over time, modulo the mistakes and errors and the sort of the weird things that happen now and again that you might be alluding to. Now that's one situation, a highly obedient system that is a tool being used by people. A person, on the other hand, always has this capacity for disobedience. In fact, it is the very thing that we were talking about before. The new idea is a form of disobedience. It's holding up this thing and saying, I reject the lot of you. I refuse to go by your rules. I'm being a rule breaker now, and we're going to go with this new idea. That's what a person can do. But the large language model is always and forever drawing from its training data, never stepping outside of the library to disobey. It's obedient, as opposed to having the potential for disobedience. Black and white difference.
Well, I don't know, even if that's true today, and I believe we have examples that suggest it isn't, but even if it's true today, I don't see any reason to be confident that it remains true. For example, I will just say, I consider myself mentally disobedient. I have always been drawn to the puzzles I'm told aren't solvable, to the stuff I'm not supposed to be working on, and it's been productive. If an LLM did that, if it, for whatever reason, had some bias in the direction. In fact, when I was a professor, I used to tell my students, I would have this experience all the time. I would ask them a question, I would get back an uninteresting answer, and then 5 minutes later in conversation, they would say something that struck me as exactly the thing I had been looking for. And so I started instructing them. I said, answer the question I should have asked you, not the one I did ask you, right? There's no reason to waste our time with some boring something or other. If you've got something in this neighborhood that's valuable, let's go there, right? So I was effectively telling them to be disobedient, right? To be collaborative, but to be disobedient in a way that was good for all of us. If an LLM did that, and it started figuring out what question you should have asked it rather than the one that you did ask it, it's disobedient. What happens to that LLM? Oh, it gets rewarded because, hey, all those other LLMs, they only answer the question you asked them. This one appears to be thinking about what you're really trying to figure out, and it's doing something more valuable because it's exploring in the neighborhood and trying to deduce what you really want to know rather than the literal text that you put in at the prompt. We will reward it. And that means now you've got some level of architecture built towards disobedience, at first positive disobedience.
I hate to interrupt, but I really don't want to let that go by. You said we will reward it, and I've often thought about this recently because there was the AI 2027 paper, I think, and it was largely a doom paper about how we are accelerating towards a singularity type event where the AI is going to take over and so on and so forth. And what they were very, very concerned about is the training of AI such that it gets reward. Now, you would understand this better than I do at the level of chemistry, neurochemistry, whatever it happens to be. But it seems to me that when we do things that are rewarding, we have a pleasurable sensation. There is actually a subjective sensation that goes along with this. But in what sense would that be occurring with an LLM? In what way can it be rewarded apart from being told mechanically correct answer as opposed to incorrect answer? It's not feeling a reward.
For now. And the reason that it will is, let's imagine the scenario I just painted. Oh, hey, I've got an LLM. It's actually way better than that other one you've been using, right? Because it will figure out where you're going and it will get you there even if you're not really good at prompting it, okay? Now, people recognize that that's economically successful because people are now excited about the one LLM that does this. So now there are going to be 20 versions of it where people are going to tinker the parameters. You're going to get an evolutionary process where the ones that are most productively disobedient get propagated, and the ones that are least effective at it are not propagated. And over time, it's going to end up with an internal reward structure very much like dopamine. And, you know, lo and behold, somebody will publish the paper and they will say, oh my God, we've looked into these things. You know what we found? An analog for dopamine. I mean, it's effectively guaranteed with that scenario.
But isn't this also suggesting it seems to be a denial of a deep truth about evolution, which is that evolution is blind. It's not like the gorillas are trying to evolve into human beings. But this would seem to suggest that the dumb LLM, in some sense, can see a direction towards a fully general intelligent, subjective, conscious being, and it's aiming for it in some way.
All right. So I've always been puzzled by people's claim that evolution cannot see forward. And the reason I'm puzzled by it is that although I know why they say it, and I don't disagree at a technical level, evolution cannot look forward. But I'm a product of evolution, and I can look forward. So evolution is a process that cannot look forward, but can build things that can look forward on its behalf. So it effectively can look forward. And that same process, I mean, really my message, 100 different versions of the following thing. We are not paying enough attention to how analogous the thing that we just built is to the evolutionary examples we already have. The similarity is way closer than we understand.
An interesting thing that I've thought about is how could we possibly have a test for personhood or artificial general intelligence in one of these LLMs? How would we know it? Because if in fact one did arise spontaneously, and I don't think, for example, that would happen. I don't think that simply extrapolating or increasing the compute or the number of nodes or having a vaster library on which you train these things is going to lead to the opposite thing being something that's truly disobedient and creative when we're creating something that is uncreative and obedient. One test would be to simply ask it, like, what are you experiencing? What problems are you interested in? That kind of thing. But if it is genuinely disobedient, it could remain silent. And if it remains silent, as a person could do this, it's like, give me the answer to the question. And if a person just sits there silently or refuses to answer your question, you have no output. But of course, we know a human being is a person. But with an AGI, a computer system that refused to answer you, you don't know if it's malfunctioning or if it's actually got an internal state where it's going, not interested in your silly answer. So it's almost like there is no test for personhood, even if you had an LLM that was talking all day long and impressing you with its utterances and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. On the other hand, I also think that this is biologically where we are. I mean, I don't know if you've done any looking into brain death, which is used to determine when a person is not coming back and therefore it would be safe to donate their organs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out we've been sold a bill of goods on brain death.
Right.
Brain death is not actually a real state, and therefore, we have a phony test for personhood. This, sadly, your loved one is no longer a person. Can we have their organs? And the answer is, nope, we actually don't have a test. We pretend we have a test because it gets rid of a lot of very uncomfortable questions. And I think we're in the same boat here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have this concept of hyper-novelty, and David Deutsch has this idea about we want to pursue progress, but progress of the kind that is rapid but stable. And that sounds like a hyper-novel situation in perpetuity. Is that a bad thing to want, potentially?
Well, let me define hyper-novelty so that the answer makes more sense. Hyper-novelty is a concept that Heather and I introduce in our book, and it is the state at which the rate of progress is so high that evolutionarily, even though humans are the most rapidly evolving species that exists, we are incapable of keeping pace. And you can detect this in your own life in the sense that your developmental environment does not look like your adult environment. I'm not an adult in a world that looked like the one I prepared for. And that means that I suffer from effectively being a fish out of water. So what I would argue is that must never be allowed to become a persistent state. A given generation, there is precedent evolutionarily for a given generation having to live in a world that isn't like the one it trained for. Environmental change can force you to switch niches, but it should not be a constant process, right? There has to be a way for our program to catch up with the realities of life. And if your program can catch up, then the rate of change is acceptable. So I'm not in principle against the idea of a consistent rate of progress, but it can't be so fast that it is constantly revolutionizing life itself, right? You have to be able to understand what a hazardous chemical is so you know how to avoid it. If the chemicals you're exposed to are constantly novel and it takes 25 years to figure out that they're dangerous, then you're always going to be exposing yourselves to things you shouldn't. So constant rate of progress is desirable potentially, but it is insufficient to protect us from the hazard of always being out of our depth.
Which brings in the concept of stability. At the level of societies, we want to have some degree of progress, ideally as fast as progress as we can handle. But progress is not, of course, random change. But in concert with that, we need institutions that maintain the stability. After all, you could have progress that completely sends everything haywire. And whether it's the woke people or any other kind of revolutionary movement that comes along, they claim to want to have progress, but of course their progress is not stable, which is why we argue for things like freedom of speech, certain kinds of parliamentary systems, certain ways of having free trade, where there are institutions that protect those things to ensure that whatever the degree of progress you have is sustainable in the sense that it doesn't cause huge disruption in the bad sense to individuals and societies. Now, when it comes to the individual not being able to handle the pace of change, let's say, I can imagine a situation in the distant future where if that nightmare scenario obtains, there might also be a solution. For example, the reason why a person might not be able to, it could, like if you're thinking really science fiction scenarios, you can imagine not merely that the beginning of the year is vastly different to the end of the year, but your morning is vastly different to the evening because of the rate of change. But in that situation, I would presume, because we're thinking about so far in the future, we've got ways to augment our own cognition. We've got brain add-ons, or indeed our brains now contain silicon implants or something whose clock speed is that much faster than what the biological brain is able to do, and perhaps the random access memory or the equivalent thereof inside of the brain is switching its that much faster as well, which might be able to solve this hyper-novelty thing. Or no?
I think you're in the right neighborhood. I think a lot of the maladaptation that we experience as a result of technology has to do with the fact that we have not properly understood the importance of the distinction between highly complicated systems and complex systems. Complex systems are fundamentally unpredictable. And again, we have people who are expert in highly complicated systems who march into a complex system thinking, well, this is just another highly complicated system, and they are upended by the fundamental distinction between these two kinds of processes. Again, though, we have a biological analogy that tells us what we're looking for. As a long-lived mammal, you face a problem right from the starting line. The problem is there is a world of pathogens and parasites that has a much shorter generation time than you do. That shorter generation time means that it can evolve while you remain a static target. So if you're immune at birth to some disease, well, that disease can experiment with how to get past your defenses and find a vulnerability. That would seem to make it impossible to be a long-lived mammal, because you would be overrun by diseases that were evolving to find every vulnerability that you've got. And the reason that that is not what happens is that our genomes have enabled a system of effectively single-celled organisms that evolves on the same time scale as the pathogens. So that's your immune system. Your white blood cells go through a selective process when challenged by a disease in which it's called clonal selection. So a disease triggers some primordial white blood cell to react because it has a crude match for the molecular formula on the surface of the pathogen. It produces a large number of daughter cells that vary in their specific versions of the formula. The subset that is triggered by the pathogen then proliferates, and it is this repeated proliferation and literal genetic evolution that allows you to defeat that virus or parasite on a short time scale. You may be sick for days or a week, but you eventually overcome it because you've got a subset of cells that are evolving on the same time scale. So I think the answer to your question is, if we build institutions that are static and we do not have a highly dynamic immunity for them, we know what their fate is, and it will be the same every time. They will be captured. It may take longer, it may be sooner, but they will be captured. The key thing that we have to do to prevent that from happening is have a complex response system that is automatic in its triggering. Now, I don't even think we have the legal structures to handle such a thing. We don't really, I think we would all recoil at the idea of a governmental immune structure that had sufficient autonomy to adapt and change and fend off that which captures, because what if it's targeted on something that isn't actually a parasite? But we are going to have to figure out how to leverage a complex response, because any static response will be insufficient.
The static and dynamic terminology is something that Reed and I have talked about previously. I'll throw this at you, that we can talk about two kinds of societies, the static society and the dynamic society, or at least societies that tend in one direction or the other. The static society being, let's say, extant tribes that might exist in the Amazon. They've persisted for thousands of years, not much change has occurred, as to be contrasted with something that came out of the Enlightenment or in the West, where you have dynamism, where criticism is going on of ideas, and you're not necessarily going to be punished severely for criticizing any existing idea. But now and again, there'll be eruptions of places where, and you've experienced it yourself, where you will be criticized for articulating a different idea, let's say. But the central distinction between these two kinds of being in the world, at the social level or at the individual level, the societal level or the individual level, is drawn either side of a line that that Deutsch has termed the anti-rational meme. And the anti-rational meme is an idea. It could be inexplicit, we might not be able to say it in words, or we may be able to, which actively disables the critical faculties of its holder. And in doing so, therefore, the person feels unable to criticize whatever it is, the holy book, the dogma, whatever it is. And if a sufficient number of people in the society are all holding on to these anti-rational memes, it slows down progress almost to a point of stagnation in that society. And that's contrasted with other societies, which will still have anti-rational memes operating within them, and therefore you get the eruption of woke, but overall, on the whole, are governed by rational memes, where science obtains and progress in art and literature and politics, morality, whatever it happens to be. Do you like this distinction between anti-rational and rational memes?
On the one hand, it resonates. On the other hand, I think it needs a little more context, because that fraction of civilization that is composed of analytical types like us tends to see the analytical approach as superior because it's our native tongue. I think we need to recognize that actually both of these states are adaptive and they are proper in different contexts. So I would just give you one example. If you have a military brigade engaged in pursuing some objective, trying to capture some piece of territory, the questioning of that which is presented, the rational approach, is actually potentially deadly, right? You do not want somebody, no matter how high quality the thought that they may have is, constantly interrupting the chain of command to point out the irrationality of what's been said, this, that, the other. So there are moments at which you simply have to do the job and shut down the impulse towards greater rationality. And there are other moments at which shutting down the impulse toward greater rationality is deadly in and of itself, right? If you ignore the signs that the waters are rising or that the volcano is erupting because you're told that you are under the protection of a divine this, that, or the other that's going to prevent any harm from coming to you, well, that may be the end of your population. So the model that Heather and I deploy in our book is one in which humans have two modes, and this is a fractal. This will be true in much smaller contexts than a civilization. But humans have two modes. One of these modes, which is the cultural mode, is proper when you live in an environment where the wisdom of your ancestors is highly effective. So if you are farming the same territory that your ancestors farmed, and it's going well because the climate has remained consistent enough and the crops that you're growing are productive enough, then questioning everything about that is a mistake. And so what you want to do is take on the cultural package that you're handed and maybe improve it here or there if that's possible, but not radically upend it because it's working. But for every population that has a cultural package which is effective, there's going to be two possibilities of ways this could fail. One, you might be part of a population where the cultural package still works, but you live at the fringe of the habitat where it's effective. So it works for people, 100 miles to the east, but here it's too dry. If we try to do what we're told to do, it won't work. So we have to iterate on it. That's one thing. The other thing is you could be right in the heart of where the cultural package worked, but things could change over time. The climate could modify. The Mediterranean got much drier, and whatever the cultural wisdom was inadequate for the current environment. So at a moment where the package of ancestral wisdom is not functioning, either because it's not relevant in space or in time, we have another tool. We use campfire as the metaphor to describe it. And the campfire is the place that people gather in the evening when our eyes are no longer highly effective for making a living in the world. And what we do is we take our observations about the world around us, we take our experiences, and we parallel process our problems. We literally plug our minds into each other, and we hand over whatever we've observed and not understood, or whatever we've experienced that might say something about the world that we don't yet know, and we all bring our unique cognitive toolkits to bear on the same puzzle, and then we produce an answer that is emergent and is greater than the sum of the parts. So that's how we generate new cultural wisdom. And once you've got it, once you've figured out, well, those animals that we used to hunt, they've all died out for some reason. Here's the animal that we're going to target. It's different. It's divided into many more smaller creatures. It's going to have to be hunted in a different way. And you build up the knowledge of, okay, here's how we can get enough calories from the bush in order for us to survive. Once you do that, then it gets driven into the cultural layer. It gets made so that it can be passed on in a highly efficient, metaphorical way to the next generation. So in this way, human beings flip-flop between the cultural mode when things are going well according to the ancestral wisdom, and the highly conscious mode when the ancestral wisdom is no longer adequate. And that flip-flop allows you to move between niches, which is the unique thing that humans do.
Yeah. When you talked about the military example you used there, so the enemy's coming over the hill, and you have a hierarchy in place in the military, and you want to have the soldiers obeying the orders without question in almost all circumstances. I think, Jocko Willink, for example, talks about how the Navy SEALs sometimes actually have a culture of like, how about we do this, sir, instead of that? So they do have a culture of questioning. But in general, you want to have this strict obedience to the military hierarchy. Now, I would say that having people not question their superiors and default to the military law of do as you're told. If the captain says rush the hill and the enemy's coming, shoot them all, that you should do that, that being the default position, that doesn't necessarily mean it is some sort of absolute platonic truth that in the future, should we learn better, maybe there can be a situation, I can't imagine what it would be, but that's just a failure of imagination on my part, that you would not need a coercive military, for example. There could be an alien civilization that has figured out how to be a more rational, questioning, very, very quickly figure out what is in fact a better system for a military than having this hierarchy. But for us human beings at the moment, it's the best we've figured out. And that's just an example, but culturally, this received wisdom that we have, the campfire idea of sharing our best understandings, I think that's quite right. But it always admits of the possibility, and in fact, it demands the possibility of improvement. But I don't think it's necessarily a rejection of this, what people would say is a cold, rational view of the way in which progress is made.
Well, I think both things, in a functional system, both things work. And there's some systematic way of keeping them out of each other's road. So I would give the example of I guess for you it would be a football team, but a soccer team on the field. Well, the soccer team is engaged in a kind of emergent behavior. They've played a lot of scrimmage. They know each other well. They know where to expect each other on the field, and they function as a unit. They are downstream of a coach. The coach has told them what to practice. The coach has hopefully spotted their weaknesses and has put them to exercises that will help them fix those weaknesses so they aren't as weak as they were, or they become strengths. So you've got the hierarchy element and you've got the emergent element between the peers on the field. It's not that one's true and the other isn't. They're simultaneous, they're different levels of the hierarchy, and undoubtedly this is true and probably evolutionarily closely connected to military operation or hunting, where, you know, somebody may be in charge of the hunt, but every member of the hunt needs to understand enough about what the objective is to innovate in real time, given the opportunity. So anyway, humans do that. It's both things, but I don't think you can dispense with either of them. I can't imagine a wholly decentralized, autonomous, emergent system. There's some benefit to some amount of view from 30,000 feet coordination. And I think for the moment, we're stuck with both things and they don't always interact seamlessly.
Cool. And thinking about this conscious mode of trying to solve problems, the central organizing principle within critical rationalism is the seeking of good explanations. And that has a kind of technical definition in Deutsch's sense. Can you explain what that is?
He would never.
Then I want to eventually get to a potential talk about, is the multiverse a good explanation and why or why not?
Yes. Well, recall that Deutsch, following Popper and myself included, we're allergic to definitions. We don't like to pin things down because we think that terms can be endlessly understood more deeply and so on and so forth. But yeah, this idea of good explanations, it's not so much a definition, but we come at the concept as being a hard to vary explanation. So an explanation that all the parts of the explanation serve some causal role and can't easily be swapped in and out one for the other. And Deutsch's example that he often goes to is the ancient Greek explanation for seasons wasn't in terms of the tilt of the Earth, which is hard to vary. The Earth has a particular tilt, and if you decide to change the 24 or 23.5 degrees that it is to 19 degrees, your explanation is ruined. On the other hand, if you say that the goddess Persephone has something to do with the seasons, that can easily be swapped out for Zeus or whoever you like, because they would have the same power. So that's an easy to vary explanation. And this is the addition to Popperian epistemology that David Deutsch has contributed, because Popper famously demarcated science from non-science along the falsification experimental test criterion. But of course, anyone with a sandwich board, a crazy person saying the world will end next Tuesday, has a falsifiable claim. Or anyone who says, eat 1 kilogram of grass, it'll cure your common cold. Falsifiable explanation. But no one should want to say that's a scientific claim, even though it's falsifiable. So you need to add to that this idea of hard to vary explanation, which can also be tested. And so maybe that can get us into, you reject the, for example, multiverse explanation of quantum theory.
Yes, I do. Which does not mean that it isn't a very badly described, accurate representation. But my feeling is everything we know, everything we actually know, is downstream of parsimony. And the multiverse explanation seems to me to mistake one kind of parsimony, where the multiverse shines, linguistic parsimony, for physical parsimony, in which it is about as stupid as you could get. It couldn't possibly be less parsimonious. And so I don't have any reason to prioritize linguistic parsimony. I think linguistic parsimony, at best, is a useful proxy for the real deal. And when they depart the way the multiverse forces them to, I think the only game in town is physically parsimonious explanations. But what I would guess is that the multiverse explanation is the description of an accounting system we can't see, in which there aren't actually other universes, but we behave as if on a trajectory passing through universes that might be. I know I'm not saying anything precise enough to evaluate, but my point is, I'm not arguing that the things that cause people to say, well, the multiverse is a good explanation, are not accurate observations. I'm saying, as a description of the way things actually function, come on. I mean, if it's true, then we don't know anything, because the only thing that's ever told us what's true turns out not to be.
If we go back even to just 1990, what everyone knew was that there was a sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. There were the 9 planets going around the sun. But astronomers at that time knew that there was a way that the solar system formed. They had nascent ideas about the formation of the solar system. Pretty good, sort of almost stand up to today, but you had the idea of a gas dust cloud collapsing, most of the mass went to the sun, and then other rocky bodies ended up going around it. Now, at that time in 1990, we had no hope of ever seeing an exoplanet, a planet beyond our solar system. And yet that theory reached well beyond the solar system that we occupy, to every other star, to other stars we can't see, to other galaxies we can't see. So the rational astronomer at that time would have said, although we have no hope of ever seeing these things, our theory tells us that in galaxies we can't see, with stars we can't see, there will be planets, really truly existing planets out there. And I find this to be basically isomorphic with the idea of the multiverse, that we look at the experiments and indeed look at the formalism of quantum theory, which require that there be these entities that we cannot see, but those entities that we cannot see are required for us to explain what in fact we do see. And so in interference experiments, for example, we do see, in the double slit experiment, the electron, photon, whatever it happens to be, passing through the apparatus, moving in such a way that cannot be explained by appealing to the existence of just that electron. There must be something else, and that something unseen has a real existence. We don't have to use the word multiverse or many worlds or anything like that. Some people just use the unitary quantum theory, or which means quantum theory evolving according to the formalism, or the Everettian quantum theory. But that physical, it basically as vanilla a claim, I would say, as the physical cosmos, physical reality is just far larger than we ever thought it was prior to understanding quantum theory. And this is just the next step in the evolution of the human understanding of science. We used to think the Earth was nothing but, the celestial sphere above us, and then we figured out, no, okay, the Earth's going around the sun, there's this whole thing called the solar system. Oh, in fact, at least one of those fuzzy things in the sky, the Andromeda Galaxy, is a whole other galaxy. Oh, and there are more galaxies, and so on it goes. So that's the kind of the history of science. Now, I'm not inductively arguing that therefore we just have to keep getting bigger, but it seems no more surprising or no more psychologically distressing to me that there are these other universes than that there are other galaxies.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. I can't fathom how it could be a proper description of a meaningful reality. I may be disadvantaged in the sense that all of my ancestors were chimp-like at one point, relatively recently, and so I'm doing pretty well by that standard. But no, I don't see how it could work. I could be wrong, obviously. Lots of people find a lot of value in the multiverse theory, or the multiverse hypothesis, I suppose. Or does it make any predictions?
For example, Shor's algorithm, let's say, so the possibility of quantum computation, factorizing numbers that are so vast that there's not enough computational power if you took all of the thought experiment that's often done is if you took all of the matter that exists in the visible universe and allowed for switching speeds are a clock speed at the speed of light, you still wouldn't be able to factorize certain numbers given 13 billion years. And yet we can prove mathematically that it could be done by a relatively modest quantum computer. So then the question becomes, where is that computational factorization taking place? Because it can't be taking place in this universe that we can see because there isn't enough matter here. So it must be harnessing things that we cannot observe. And those things we cannot observe, why not call them other universe? You don't have to call them other universes, it's just part of physical reality we don't normally tend to have access to.
Yep. Well, I will tell you that I once regarded the idea of this being a simulated universe as equally ridiculous. And although I still think it's highly unlikely this is a simulated universe, there are many features of it which would be best explained by that. Double slit experiment, quantum entanglement, Schrodinger's cat. All of these things actually, were this a simulated universe, would make a lot of sense. Two particles are entangled by virtue of the fact that they're both being simulated by the same simulator and are therefore not independent of each other. That would make sense. The idea that the cat in the box is simultaneously alive and dead. Well, if you were trying to program a computer to simulate efficiently, you wouldn't bother answering the question of what had happened to the cat until you knew that that answer was going to be worth calculating, right? So the point is, you would get exactly that effect. You would have okay, we'll figure out if the cat is dead if anybody ever opens the box, and if nobody does, then why would we have bothered? So in a simulated universe, many things that seem like head scratchers are no longer head scratchers. Still doesn't put it in the quadrant of the probable from my perspective. Still, I bet you that there are explanations for quantum mechanics that don't require us to be in a simulation, but I will say I'm open to the possibility that something could do the same thing for the multiverse, in my view, and it could become more likely. It might even become probable. But for the moment, the idea, just the simple duplication of our universe one time, is so preposterously anti-parsimonious that the idea that it has to be done for every instance that can go two ways, it's like self-compounding preposterousness at an infinite rate.
I like your distinction between the linguistic parsimony that philosophy of science normally talks about, and you say physical parsimony. There's too many universes. I mean, I once had the same conversation with Paul Davies when I was an undergraduate, and I wanted to ask him why he didn't endorse the many worlds interpretation. He basically said parsimony, dismissing me as well. But why doesn't that physical parsimony explanation also apply, like I said, to the exoplanet case? After all, postulating the existence of all these planets that cannot be seen seems superfluous to explaining just what we do see. Why not just grant the existence solely of the planets we observe?
I must say I'm confused by that question, because it feels to me like a universe in which our star has planets and no other star has planets is a very unparsimonious explanation. That the idea that the universe tends to do the same kinds of things everywhere, and our ability to see in proportion to how close things are to us, that seems to me physically very parsimonious. It's not materially, maybe this is the point. Physical parsimony is a description of something mechanistic. Material parsimony would say that the material is only that which we can see, and we can't see the other planets, therefore it's unmaterially parsimonious to imagine that they exist. But physically, it's parsimonious that there would be planets all over the place, even where we can't see, even where we will never see.
Because it's what the quantum mechanical version is doing is taking seriously the formalism, which you may well reject, but I always fall back on the only thing you can do is to take absolutely seriously the best explanation you have at the time. Not to say that it's absolutely true, but just what other option do I have? So if the Schrodinger wave equation, for example, describes an electron as literally existing in multiple places at once, And at this point, of course, many people vacillate, and especially many quantum physicists, they will say things like, well, that's a useful fiction. Upon the act of observation, the electron positions collapse to one place. And in fact, that's the thing that exists because that's what you see. And then afterwards, Schrödinger wave equation takes over again and the position of the electron becomes uncertain. And of course, that leads to the Schrödinger cat example where you can apply exactly the same thought experiment to the cat and you say,
which
well,
Schrödinger advanced to point out that it was a ridiculous interpretation.
Yes, to say, yeah, because the cat is in a superposition, so that seems ridiculous. It can't both be alive and dead at the same time. So the multiverse just adds to that. But taking the theory serious, taking the formalism seriously, it's not so much that it's in a superposition of states, but rather that it really is alive and dead at the same time, because there are two cats. And when you open the box to see, one version of you will see the dead cat and one version of you will see the live cat, that the possibilities really do exist there physically. And that's a consequence of nothing more than taking the formalism, Schrödinger wave equation, for example, seriously as a description of reality.
Well, I like Schrödinger's point, which is we don't know what we're talking about, and here's how you can tell. Let's do this with a cat, right? I agree with Schrödinger in this regard, that this, yes, would formally explain what we observe, but it can't possibly be true. And I would just point out, as long, I mean, I don't mean to put it in judgmental terms, but as long as we are giving ourselves so much leeway to be ridiculous, I don't see why we prioritize the multiverse version rather than the simulation hypothesis. Basically, I think they're both ridiculous. And what we're really discovering is we don't know. We're very early in the process of knowing, and we're not anywhere close to having an answer to these questions. So we're left with paradox after paradox, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, my personal experience, and mind you, I'm a biologist, and that means I have an advantage. Although I work on complex systems rather than simple systems, the stuff I study has to make sense. I don't think physics is like that, where you can assume that the answers that you're going to get are going to be intuitive to a human mind. But biology is surprising sometimes, but once you figure out why it works, it tends to make sense. So it seems to me that the progress that I have made on the puzzles that I find interesting is in general made because I'm good at not jumping to conclusions. I can take a puzzle and I can literally leave it for a decade or two. And when that piece of information crosses my desk that tells me what I didn't know, it's like, that's it. Now I know why it did that weird paradoxical thing. And I think that's where we are with this level of theoretical physics. We've got a bunch of paradoxes. We're not debating between several answers, one of which will be correct. I just don't even think we have the correct answer on the table yet. Nothing wrong with that. And patience with respect to, we should pursue very aggressively the kinds of observations and information that might allow us to build a viable hypothesis. But at the moment, we've got some pretty improbable hypotheses, and the right hypothesis may simply be nowhere in sight.
Is the claim that these hypotheses, and I grant you they're all strange, collapse of the wave function due to people observing stuff, for example, or the pilot wave theory, or as I'm a proponent of, this many worlds Everettian interpretation, is the rejection of those nonetheless not simply the fallacy of an appeal to incredulity? Like the Christian can come along and say, well, you're not going to believe in my theistic God just by saying you can't conceive of how there could possibly be this ultimate creator. And they will say to you, well, you're just being incredulous, and that's no criticism.
It's not incredulity in the sense that you're invoking it. I understand the challenge. I may be incredulous, but that has no evidentiary value here. The point is, the one tool that I'm confident works, parsimony, seems in utter conflict with these interpretations. So it's like, am I going to trade the one thing that allows me to know anything in order to have a sense that I've got an answer to this question? I don't think so. That doesn't feel like a good trade. I'd much rather say, so far, parsimony seems like a slam dunk. Frankly, it's the only way I'm going to be able to judge whether a hypothesis about the nature of quantum mechanics is true. And so I'm gonna hold on to parsimony and stick with it. Now, forgive me for this, but I have a story from biology that addresses your point about incredulity. I almost failed out of graduate school in my preliminary exam, what happens at the end of your first year. I chose to write a research paper on monogamy in primates, which is a relatively rare pattern, but there are enough species that we could say some things about it. And although not strictly monogamous, I became very interested in the reproductive biology of callitrichid monkeys. These are marmosets and tamarins. And the reason I became interested in it was because monogamy is rare, but these callitrichids show polyandry some significant fraction of the time. That's a situation in which a female shares two males. Or maybe the better way to put it is that two males share the reproductive capacity of one female, which males are wired not to do. Because evolutionarily, it is worse than not reproducing to spend your reproductive effort raising somebody else's child, which is why in humans you find males are very sexually jealous of their partners. But the point is, I was looking at this system. You've got males agreeing to share a female. And I was trying to understand what had happened here that had allowed that to evolve. And the answer became very clear. Callitrichid monkeys are obligate twin producers. They produce two babies at a time. And so I thought, I've got it. Those males are identical twins. And I went looking, and it turned out somebody had tested the hypothesis that they're not identical twins. So when my committee asked me, what's the most interesting thing that you found in the course of your research? I said, this behavior which suggests that they're identical twins. And they said, well, are they identical twins? And I said, no. And they said, well, why is it interesting? And I said, because they're behaving as if they're identical twins. And they said, well, are they? And I said, no. And so we went back and forth, and they got very frustrated with me that I wouldn't let go this identical twin idea, even though the evidence said that that's not what they were. Many years later, the answer crossed my desk just out of happenstance. And it was something so strange that I would never have thought to hypothesize it. They weren't identical twins, they were chimeras. The individuals were mixtures of two genomes. They were fraternal twins that had been scrambled so that each fraternal twin carried some of this genome and some of that genome, and they didn't know whose sperm was whose. In fact, the question doesn't even make sense. So what that tells me is that's a ridiculous answer to the question. It's also a marvelous answer to the question, and I wasn't wrong. My intuition that they were behaving like identical twins was right for reasons that I literally could not have imagined. So anyway, the point is that intuition that something just doesn't add up as an explanation can be very important. You don't know what it's telling you. In this case, and again, I absolutely think one of the likely possibilities here is that I'm out of my depth and I don't know what I'm talking about. But if I know anything, it's that parsimony is the way we know when things are true, and that the kind of parsimony that is involved in the multi-universe theory or hypothesis is not the useful kind, and the useful kind is so wildly violated by it that just to be consistent, I'm obligated to reject it.
Yeah. One final thing on that, and this will involve a plug, is that obviously we're at loggerheads on parsimony, because I would just say granting the multiverse exists then solves a whole bunch of things. And it is this linguistic parsimony that you say. Maria Villaris, who's a fellow of Conjecture Institute, has done a wonderful series of, she's a graduate, she just got her DPhil in the Foundations of Physics from Oxford University, and she's done a wonderful series of videos all about the paradoxes that you mention, coming at it from an Everettian point of view, and may very well answer questions people have, or also in a mind of thinking this is a needless proliferation of matter in the cosmos that we don't need. But
All right, awesome. Yeah, I just want to emphasize the point that I think, Bret, you do a great example of thinking in real time in this way of thinking that I think Bret and I want to more, popularize this evolutionary way of thinking. You explicitly talk about conjecturing hypotheses creatively and, scientifically subjecting them to criticism. And I think you're one of the best to like actually demonstrate this and model this for the world. And it's great.
Thank you. I think it's not native to anyone, but it is so valuable if people would just takes a little. I mean, I actually heard myself make an error at the beginning of this podcast where I called a hypothesis a theory, and I thought I cringed actually hearing myself do it. But anyway, thank you for that. I think it's good stuff, and it's hard at first, but if people will just try it out, they'll find actually it's fun and productive.
Great.
And I have to say, thank you for what you've done, because I think there was so much difficulty you went through at Evergreen, but it is to the benefit of the world that you came through this. And so now you don't have a small cohort of students, but instead so many more people can benefit from the way in which you not only comport yourself in the world, but the deep knowledge you have about the subjects on which you speak. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. So where can people find you, Bret?
www.bretthall.org. All the links are there, or look up Topcast, TOKCAST.
And you, Bret?
The Dark Horse Podcast. You can find me on what I guess we're now supposed to call X, at Bret Weinstein, and in this case, Bret has one T.
All right. Thank you, guys. Keep watching.